I'd like to thank everybody first for joining us for this update to the status of Duchenne's nomination to the recommended uniform screening panel. So I'm Catherine Anderson from PPMD, and I'm really glad to have with me today Lauren Stanford from PPMD, Joel Kartner from the Muscular Dystrophy Association, and Annie Kennedy from Every Life Foundation. I think we might also have Paul from MDA joining us. But let me start by orienting everyone to some of the terminology that we're using and some of the background leading up to this month. And so PPMD and MDA have worked together for more than a decade to establish a foundation of resources and evidence on which Duchenne newborn screening was built. And in 2022, our organizations co-sponsored the submission of a nomination to add Duchenne to the Recommended Uniform Screening Panel, or RUSP as an acronym, which is a list of conditions that are recommended by the federal government to be included in state newborn screening programs. Historically, a federal committee called the Advisory Committee on Heritable Disorders in Newborns and Children, or ACHDNC, we're probably just going to be referring to it as the committee for ease of speech today. That committee historically received these nominations and voted to offer a recommendation for which of the nominated conditions should be added to the RUSP. So those recommendations went to the HHS secretary who made the final decision. The recommendation by the ACHDNC was informed by a report developed by an evidence review group, or ERG as an acronym. And that group organizes all the available data about the impact of newborn screening for a condition and presents it to the committee for that vote. Our nominations evidence review was in its final stages and was going to be presented to the committee for a vote during the meeting that was originally set to take place May 8th and 9th, before it was announced that the committee was dissolved. So with that groundwork, I want to emphasize that PPMD and MDA are still working together to move forward after that announcement. And for now, I can turn it over to Annie to kind of set the stage for the rest of this discussion.
Sure. Thanks, Catherine. So first of all, thank you everyone for being on here today. This is just such a phenomenal community, and it's just such a privilege to get to continue to work with all of you. So first of all, it's really wonderful to have PPMD and MDA here together as the nominators for Duchenne as a condition for consideration to the RUSP. And thank you, Catherine, for dispelling some of our alphabet soup that we'll be talking about here today. So that's the reason why PPMD and MDA are here together, because as the nominators who've jointly moved the condition forward, they've continued to be working together to sort of navigate a strategy for how to make sure that that condition, now that there's an evidence review underway, has the opportunity to have that evidence assessed and ensured that there is a path forward for that condition, which Paul and Catherine will continue to talk about. So for today, we're going to talk about what that looks like and what the community is doing to ensure that moves forward. That's the short-term issue we're going to talk through today. There are also broader considerations right now for the larger rare disease community. So after they talk through that, I'm just going to briefly provide a little bit of an overview of how the broader rare disease community is poised to wrap our arms around Duchenne, and the MLD community, which is another community that also has a condition in a very similar place as the Duchenne community, and how we're poised to provide some support to both Duchenne and MLD. So I'll tag back in a moment, talk about that. And then there are some intermediate and longer term considerations for the overall Duchenne newborn screening, or the overall newborn screening landscape. And so I'll also provide just a little bit of context around what some of those engagements are, because I know many here are also engaged in the broader rare disease ecosystem. So I'll tag back in with a few highlights around that. But since I know we're really here to talk specifically about Duchenne, we're going to turn it back over to MDA and then PPMD, who are just going to provide a little bit of insight into what the strategy right now is, what proposed timelines might look like, and what the opportunities for action and activity are for our Duchenne community to make sure that we're on the right path. And as we know, failure is never an option in Duchenne. And then I'll tag back in and talk about some of the other opportunities in the broader landscape for rare. So I think I'm handing it off to Paul.
All right, thanks very much, Annie. And thank you everybody for joining us this morning or this afternoon. I am Paul Melmeyer. I'm the Executive Vice President of Public Policy and Advocacy at the Muscular Dystrophy Association, MDA, joined here by Joel Kartner, our Director of Access Policy at MDA. And really, it is a privilege to be in front of you today to give you an update on our efforts on Duchenne newborn screening. So as Catherine said at the outset, really kind of the key reason for why we're gathering today is the recent dissolution of the ACHDNC. As Catherine already said, the acronym, I'll say it one more time, the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Heritable Disorders in Newborns and Children. It had been this committee, of course, that was reviewing our nomination for Duchenne to be added to the recommended uniform screening panel. Now, there's a couple things that we wanted to emphasize about the role of the ACHDNC, about our federal partners in general and their work with the newborn screening, and about how a lot of the progress that we've been working towards, we're excited that it should still be able to continue for a number of different reasons. And I'll touch on a few of those, and then I'll be handing it over to Catherine to talk about a few of those as well. But the ACHDNC is a federal advisory committee. It's made up of advisors that have been are experts in some way within newborn screening. It previously had been a committee that was statutorily authorized, meaning that Congress had written into law that this committee was to exist and have certain responsibilities. But that authorization actually expired a handful of years ago. And we've been working with a lot of our partners in the advocacy space to try to get Congress to reauthorize in statute, in law, that this committee was to be to continue operating. Now, thankfully, within the law, the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services is allowed to continue the committee if they so chose. And it was actually Secretary Azar under the previous Trump administration that chose to have this committee continue its work, to meet as frequently as it was, to consider new nominations, et cetera, et cetera. Now, because it's the Secretary's discretion to have the committee operate, it's also his or her discretion to have the committee not operate. And that's what just happened in the last week or so with the termination of the ACHDNC. Now, one of the things that this committee does is it determines what is to be recommended to the Secretary to be added to the RUSP, the Recommended Uniform Screening Panel. And this is the panel that the federal government hands to states to say, we recommend that you state whatever, you Michigan, you Utah, you Texas, you whatever state that you happen to be living in, these are the conditions we recommend that you screen for. And the RUSP is there so that each state doesn't have to recreate their wheel 50 times, if you will, or even more than that, because the District of Columbia has its own panel, as do territories for that matter. And so it's this recommended uniform screening panel that the ACHDNC deliberates on, that it creates, it takes nominations, and then if the ACHDNC agrees with the nominators, of course, for our case, it's us and Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, that they then recommend to the Secretary, hey, Secretary so-and-so, we believe you should add this condition to the RUSP. Now, the good news, even with the ACHDNC having been dissolved in the last week or two, the RUSP still exists. It's still a recommended uniform screening panel that the federal government recommends that states use as they construct their newborn screening panels. That has not gone away. The RUSP is still very much intact, and consequently, speaking for the Muscular Dystrophy Association, spinal muscular atrophy and Pompe disease are still recommended by the federal government as neuromuscular disorders that should be screened for at the state level. And Catherine is going to talk a little bit about how Duchenne could still be added to the recommended uniform screening panel potentially, even without the ACHDNC not being in place. Because again, it's the Secretary's discretion to actually be adding things. The ACHDNC advises the Secretary to add diseases to the RUSP, but it's not the ACHDNC that necessarily makes that decision itself. They do 99% of the work, if you will, but it's the Secretary themselves that make that decision. So we'll come back to that here in a moment. The other thing, though, that I want to mention is that these are just federal recommendations to states. It's not up to the federal government actually which states are going to be screening for what. It's up to the states to make that decision. And we've seen already several states move forward with screening for Duchenne. We, I believe, have 2 states that are actively screening for Duchenne right now, they being Minnesota and they being Ohio. And we also have 2 additional states that intend to be screening for Duchenne very shortly, they being Massachusetts and New York. And I can tell you that within the state sessions that have been happening over the course of the last several months, there have been a number of different state legislatures as well as administrations in states that have been considering adding Duchenne to their state panels as well. And hopefully maybe here in a little bit, we'll have more than just 4 states that are intending to screen for Duchenne. We'll have additional states from there. So I want to emphasize that even without the ACHDNC currently being active, it still is the states themselves that decide on which screens they're going to add to their panels. And so that work will also continue, even as the ACHDNC is not constituted as it has been. So there is still much progress ongoing at the federal level, which Catherine will mention a little bit further here in a moment, but also at the state level, and that there's a lot of work happening in the states to still work to add Duchenne to state panels. So with that, before I hand it over to Catherine, I'm going to turn it to my colleague Joel Kartner to see if there's anything further that I may have missed within our portion of the update.
Everybody, great to meet those of you that I haven't met before. The only other thing that I would kind of toss in is, while we are ardently pursuing getting DMD added to the RUSP, the other thing that we really want to support is, in the absence of the ACHDNC, still we want to be working with our partners to make sure that we're supporting the integrity of the evidence review process, and making sure that as things come back online and we work with partners to get that program up and moving again, that program integrity is still kind of at the forefront of what we're aiming for in these processes. But other than that, I can pass it over to Team PPMD.
Thank you so much. So thinking of the federal work and federal advocacy, I want to reflect again that the vote, the recommendation that comes from the ACHDNC is really embedded in the work of that evidence review group, the report that they make that summarizes the evidence showing what the impact of newborn screening would be. And we have been in communication with the leader of the evidence review group for Duchenne. And what we've learned is that they expect to be able to complete their report. And instead of presenting it to the committee, it'll be published publicly. And this will take time, and we don't expect it to be published by the original May meeting date. And it'll be at least a month, likely early June, which gives us time to sort of understand what the landscape looks like in that moment and choose our best path forward for how to take that evidence to that final decision to be added to the RUSP. And we are so grateful to the committee and to the evidence review group for all the work that it's taken to get to this point, and the evidence review group in particular for their continued commitment to completing their effort. The report is going to be hugely valuable in advocating for Duchenne newborn screening at both the federal and the state level, and certainly will have a clear direction for those next steps once it's released. So working together, our organizations, and also with the metachromatic leukodystrophy community, which was another condition that was up for the vote at the same time as ours, to determine that best fit, to review the report, and to make that decision for RUSP and other advocacy efforts. And I think that it is fair then to turn it over to Annie to reflect more on what these next steps are as a full community.
Great, thanks everybody. Emily, if you could pull up the slides. So I'm a visual person, and so I thought it would be helpful because Paul, Joel, and Catherine just provided a lot of really great information. And so I created a couple of visuals to take us through a recap of what they just went through for everybody. So this image is what the typical nomination implementation pathway, just in sort of rough terms, would look like if everything went as planned. So you would start with your evidence development process. Then you would, once your evidence was developed, you would submit your nomination to the RUSP to the Advisory Committee on Heritable Disorders in Newborns and Children. If for some reason the nomination committee didn't feel that your package was in order or the evidence wasn't together, that wouldn't be accepted at that point, and you would need to continue to build more evidence. So that's that arrow that drops down. If it is accepted, then it moves forward for evidence review. So you've heard Catherine talking about the evidence review process. The evidence review starts a clock, and there is a 9-month time period that the evidence review is supposed to take place before some type of finding or recommendation is then provided to the advisory committee. And then the advisory committee convenes, determines whether or not to vote, or if they need more information, it can go back to the evidence review group, or they can vote either yes or no to add a condition to the recommended uniform screening panel. At that point, then there is a recommendation that goes to the secretary of HHS, and then the secretary is the one who then makes the final recommendation to add a condition to the RUSP. And that is technically when states can then consider those conditions for implementation in the states. If we can go to the next slide. Or hit, okay. This is the timeline for what the Duchenne trajectory has been. So you can see that we officially began in 2011. There was a pilot in Ohio that really kicked off. And actually the first meeting around the neuromuscular conditions was at NIH in 2009. But when we really started in Duchenne was in 2011. And then you can see really what our journey has been. The first nomination to the RUSP was actually not accepted right away. We were asked for a little more information. We did not have to do a new nomination. We just had to clarify some information and bring some of that evidence back. And then the evidence review group started working in August of 2023. Those evidence review committees then were to move forward. Actually, and I have that date wrong. It is now 2025, not 2023. We need to update that on the slides. If we can hit the animation. It is the May 2025, not 2023, review that is now what is in question, because this committee does not exist. So the question is, what is the entity that will review the evidence review package now that it is completed? Everything else in this infrastructure, the RUSP and the evidence, exist. So as Paul explained really well, we are now, as a community, and the Duchenne community is coming together to say, we have learned and heard that there will be a published evidence review, as Catherine explained. And what the Duchenne community is now working on is to understand what is the entity that will review that evidence so that that determination can then be moved forward for admission to the RUSP. Can you go to the next slide? Okay. Once that decision's made, it would then hopefully be a positive decision that would be then added to the RUSP. That's the Duchenne community's perspective. It is also the issue, the short-term issue that is being faced by the MLD community. The Duchenne community and the MLD community have been in constant, frequent communication and are on a very similar timeline right now. So are working very closely together so that they can work together to understand which entity will be reviewing both evidence review packages once they're available. For the broader rare disease community, the broader rare disease community has flagged support to support the Duchenne and MLD communities in any way that we can be supportive, and are following the lead of the Duchenne and MLD communities. So whatever you're asking of us, we are here to provide support. But more broadly, for the broad rare disease community, there are many communities that are also working within the system that have conditions that would be eligible for admission to the federal RUSP, but had not yet submitted nomination packages. So there are many communities that are developing evidence that were in earlier stages, that were working on developing pilots or had pilots underway, and now have a lot of questions around what is the entity that will now review conditions, will now accept nominations, and may even determine what evidence would be needed for a nomination package. So that, when I talk about the short-term, intermediate, and long-term, that's what we mean when we say intermediate. That is the larger conversation being had in the rare disease community as to what is the entity that will be restored or stood up as the body that adjourns decision-making around nominations, evidence review for the unified federal newborn screening program. If we can get to the next slide. Okay, I think it's really important for us to understand, though, that the overall newborn screening system and the overall newborn screening ecosystem is still intact. What has been disrupted and what we're talking about is the advisory committee. The overall newborn screening system, though, exists. So state condition implementation is ongoing. There is some moving of the parts and pieces as far as where federal agency funding will be going. Last night, this is a very savvy community, may have seen that the president's proposed budget for fiscal year 2026 funding was leaked, and that includes potential changes to how federal agency funding into newborn screening may go. But we were pleased to see that some of the really critical line items for the muscular dystrophies still exist, but they may move. And there will be more information about that as we learn about that. But it's really important to understand that the newborn screening system and ecosystem still exists. But we as a broad advocacy community and the Duchenne community are activated and advocating to ensure that wherever it exists, whether it remains at CDC or HRSA or NICHD, or moves in a more prominent way into the newly formed, what's being called the Administration for a Healthy America, or the AHA, that it is a robust and maybe even stronger than ever before newborn screening ecosystem, because that is what our community needs and deserves. And so I just want to flag gratitude to both PPMD and MDA for your leadership and your thoughtful strategy, and for also working so well with the federal agency partners who are still really leaning in to support this condition nomination moving forward, and with the state leaders who've been working with us. And also, there are so many in the community who've been supporting these efforts, both on the federal and the state level, and even just very recently participated in the newborn screening symposium and brought data forward to really help inform this nomination. All of those efforts have mattered so much and have led to this moment. And so there are multiple sign-on opportunities that are coming. And so those will be disseminated by the Duchenne partners and by some of the larger rare disease communities that will be coming. There will be, we at Every Life will be working with the Congressional Rare Disease Caucus to convene a briefing on May 20th around newborn screening. The National Academies for Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine have a study that has been underway for some time that we anticipate will be released in the coming weeks around newborn screening. And there will be opportunities to highlight findings that show how we can really modernize and enhance our newborn screening system. And at our caucus briefing on May 20th, we will be doing all of those things, and are really pleased that there will be members of our Duchenne community who will be testifying there and talking about really the importance of moving Duchenne forward. So we're really grateful to everybody in this community, and especially PPMD and MDA for your leadership. So I'll turn it back to Lauren, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I know there are a few questions in the chat that I saw that maybe we can just take a few of them. And one person asked if we recommend that state efforts should continue. Yes, absolutely. I feel like we are operating now, like, keep doing what you're doing. And hopefully when this report comes out, that will be a support tool for the state effort. I feel like we're operating this statewide, we're doing the same stuff. And I just want to, I don't know, Annie, Paul, if you have anything to add there, but I just want to make sure everyone knows that we should keep doing that.
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing I would add to that is once that report is available, I think that will be a really important tool and enhancement to state advocacy efforts.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. And then Annie, perhaps you can answer this one too. If DMD screening is added to the RUSP, does that mean it's required for states to screen? What are the next steps?
Yeah, that's a great question. So once a condition is added to the RUSP, that means that it's a recommended uniform screening panel. So then of those conditions, states then have a state-by-state process where then they consider conditions that are on that federal recommended uniform screening panel for addition within their states. That process is so variable within every state as to how long it takes for states to consider those conditions, what are the resource requirements for a state to add a condition within their state, and what the timelines are for states to add conditions that have been added to the federal RUSP. In 13 states in the US, there has been legislation passed in those states that actually EveryLife and our partners have passed that has requirements for conditions that have met the evidentiary requirements of the RUSP to be added within stated timelines. Usually it's within 2 years. And when we've passed that legislation, we've already made the arrangements for the resources to be available to those states to add those conditions. So for about 50% or 52% of babies born in the US are in RUSP-aligned states. And so we've really targeted states that had the higher birth rates for those first 13 states. And that's available on our website if you're interested in which states that those are. In addition to those 13 states, we're also currently working on that legislation in Wisconsin. Beyond those states, then there are the states that the Duchenne community is currently working in to have Duchenne added. And then the other states outside of the RUSP states and the Duchenne states would be the ones that this coalition together would be probably leaning in immediately to work on having Duchenne added. I think it's important to note that there is a very active coalition of organizations in Duchenne who are working together on Duchenne State Edition and who meet regularly. I think it's meeting weekly at this point, who are working to have very coordinated efforts around the state edition of Duchenne. So I think it's important for this community to know that everybody really is working in a very coordinated way on those approaches. But there is no automatic addition of those conditions, but there has been a very strategic approach to ensuring that Duchenne is being added.
Thank you, Annie. And I've seen a few questions in the chat around our specific approach with our nomination package. And I just want to reiterate that right now we're waiting for the publication. I think that's our big next step. And then once we receive that, we're going to have hopefully our plan of how we move forward set then. But I will reemphasize that we are working in lockstep with the MLD community. We're in touch with the folks over there who did their nomination package also. So we're working very closely together. We don't have the exact methodology of how we're going to reach out or who we're going to reach out to because that hasn't been determined yet, but we are working with the MLD community. And as soon as there is a pathway, we will keep all of you informed, and I'm sure we will need support from the community. But we will keep you guys looped, but we just wanted to have this call to let you know that that their steps are being made and it's very much in process, but we don't know exactly what the pathway is. And I see there was a question about where it would be published. Catherine, correct me if I'm wrong, but we aren't exactly sure where exactly it'll be published at this point, right? Yeah, okay. But we will also keep you informed of that too. And I see a few folks raised their hands to ask questions, but if you wouldn't mind typing it into the chat just because of the settings, that would be great. But well, if other folks are thinking of any other questions, I can let you know that if you have any other questions, like feel free to email me or Catherine or Paul or Joel, and we're happy to chat with you about all of that. We can send out a blast with our contact information following this webinar. We're also recorded this, so it'll be up shortly for you to share with other folks who might not have been able to join, but we really appreciate all of you joining us. And it's going to take the whole community to get this across the finish line. So I'm sure you'll be hearing from us, but we really appreciate you being here and joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.